Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Napoleon Seizes Power, the Brumaire Coup by Epic History. So last time we saw the end of Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. He returned to France when he saw that the military situation was worsening. Today we'll see what exactly Napoleon gets up to when he returns. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video. We need Bonaparte. That's what he wanted to hear.
October 1799. After 500 days campaigning in Egypt and Syria, Napoleon has returned to France.
500 days. That is a lot of time to spend, not only away from France, but in Egypt, in the Ottoman Empire. You know, he had been distanced from his country for quite a while and ended up achieving, frankly, not that much. So now it's time for Napoleon to come back to France and really reassert himself.
And with a small entourage, he travels north to Paris. Everywhere he goes, he is greeted by crowds, embraced by dignitaries, and feted as a conquering hero.
Yeah, well, you know, Napoleon had saved the government from royalist rebels. He had fought off enemies at Toulon. He had won the fantastic Italian campaign, which was a thing of true military genius, and he had just returned from Egypt while, you know, it wasn't a massively successful expedition. You can be sure that Napoleon had sent news of his great victories back to France. And so Napoleon was absolutely greeted as a military hero. I would say primarily due to the work he'd done in Italy. That is what had really built up his reputation with the public. I mean, we saw in Epic History's videos on, you know, Napoleon in Italy that, I mean, not only was he a brilliant military commander, but he was always thinking about politics, always thinking about how to move through the ranks, how to promote himself to the French public, and so this is something that Napoleon has very successfully been working on.
But such celebrations cannot hide that France is a country in crisis and despair. Banditry is so rife that Napoleon's own luggage is stolen en route. Prices are soaring. So too are taxes. Trade has been decimated by years of war and blockade. There is conscription, censorship, and corruption. Abroad, France once more faces a powerful coalition of enemies. And though General Massena's brilliant victory at Zurich has won respite, France is not safe yet.
Yeah, well, when Napoleon receives news of France's condition in Egypt, he was allowed to get that news by Sir Sidney Smith of the British fleet, because it wasn't necessarily good news. France was in a pretty dire situation. Now, by the time Napoleon made his way back to France, it wasn't quite as bad as he had read in the newspaper, right? The military situation had stabilized a bit. You know, I mean, the fear, I'm sure, when Napoleon had received that newspaper was that France was facing an imminent invasion of its territory. As you can see, things have cooled down a little, but it's still not in a great military situation. And of course, politically, France is struggling. You know, we're in 1799. We are, at this point, years into the government of the Directory. And they listed a bunch of the issues that were occurring. I sort of chuckled when they said corruption because the Directory was notoriously corrupt. You know, we've gone through the French Revolution. Well, there's a bit of a debate as to when exactly the French Revolution ended, but we've definitely left the most revolutionary phase of the French Revolution, right? We've passed through many different governments, and for a couple of years now, we've been with the Directory, though there have been coups in the meantime, but essentially the Directory has been governing. And after all that revolutionary violence and upheaval, who was left to govern this country? Well, it's essentially the survivors, the opportunists, those who weren't necessarily driven by political principle, but driven by their own survival. So these are people who are mainly looking out for themselves, fantastically corrupt, concerned about saving their own skin, and you could say these are not necessarily the best people to be leading your country. And so France is faced with a whole array of social, political, economic, and military problems that, frankly, have been present for a while, and they're not really getting much better. Perhaps they need one grand figure to arrive and save them. Well, that's certainly the perspective of one Napoleon Bonaparte. Others disagree, but, France is not in a fantastic situation.
But in Bonaparte, many see a savior for the country.
Right. That's certainly how he sees it, but a lot of your average French people feel that way as well. I mean, Napoleon has brought France so much glory abroad. Maybe he could bring France glory at home.
Thanks to his own propaganda, everyone has heard of his brilliant victories in Italy and Egypt.
Yep.
His name is celebrated in newspapers and plays. The air rings with cries of, "Hurrah for Bonaparte! He will save the country."
I mean, it's like in his campaign in Italy, Napoleon totally changed up the entire, frankly, geopolitical situation, right? He moved France forward massively. And then, he's off in Egypt. While France is sort of suffering at home, people are hearing in the newspapers great tales of Napoleon's victories. They're not hearing that much about the failures. They're hearing all the good parts. And then he comes back in time to save the country. It's a good narrative, and one that, of course, Napoleon himself crafted, but that did rely on his very real military genius and political instincts. But he was very good at selling himself to the people of France, selling this narrative, selling himself as the savior figure, and people really believed it.
Not everyone is thrilled by
No.
the general's return.
They are not.
At the very top of French government, some wonder if Bonaparte should not be court-martialed for abandoning his army in Egypt. And now,
Well, if we remember, when there were discussions about Napoleon going to Egypt, right, there were discussions between Napoleon and the Directory, and both were on board with him going to Egypt. This is something that Napoleon wanted to do. He wasn't, forced or anything. But even at that point, some members of the Directory, one of the reasons they sent him to Egypt is because they wanted him sort of out of the way. Because if we remember, during the Italian campaign, Napoleon was already overstepping his bounds. He was acting as sort of an independent political figure. And of course, if you're a general in the field, a commander in the field, you need some sort of autonomy from the government, especially at this time in history, right? Communication back and forth can still be pretty slow, but Napoleon was really politically asserting himself, and some members of the Directory were beginning to feel threatened. And now, in a time of, chaos, essentially, though, seems like this era is always a time of chaos, Napoleon has returned to France as some sort of triumphant savior. If you felt threatened by Napoleon before, you probably feel even more threatened by him now.
flouting France's quarantine laws. However, Napoleon does now have a letter from the Directory ordering his return to France, though he acted before receiving it. There's also concern that a move against such a hugely popular general could easily backfire.
I mean, you could see why there were so many comparisons between Napoleon Bonaparte and Julius Caesar. The French Directory is very much facing a Roman Senate, Julius Caesar type situation, where you have this general who has won, military victory and glory in the field and is extremely popular with the people, but who worries the political elite. and they have to try and navigate this situation.
For his part, Napoleon regards the government with contempt. A sentiment he's happy to share in private.
Which is fair enough. I mean, the government, as I said, it's not a great government. Very corrupt, very self-interested, Not to say every member of the government. I mean, you can pick out a few who still have some sort of political principles. But overall, this is not really a government to be respected. Now, is Napoleon's solution the right one? That's up for debate. But I think it's pretty fair that a lot of people did not have much love for the Directory at this point.
Over breakfast, he tells General Thibault, "These men are bringing France down to the level of their own blundering. They are degrading her." Well, what can generals expect from this government of lawyers?
Oh, uh-oh.
To Napoleon, it's self-evident that he would do a better job, given all his glorious achievements in Italy and Egypt.
Yeah. It's unsurprising he believed this. We've seen throughout his career, he constantly compared himself to Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, these heroes of old. He's constantly had pretty grand political ambitions, so no surprise that Napoleon comes back and is like, man, what if I ran the government? It's like, yeah, this is pretty much expected.
Since 1795, France has been ruled by the Directory, a 5-man executive whose members hold power for 5 years. In 1799, its members are Paul Barras, Napoleon's first patron,
Yep.
infamously corrupt and dissolute, but a shrewd political operator. He has been a permanent member of the Directory since its formation.
Yeah, if we remember Barras, he's been a big part of sort of Napoleon's early career. His first, real sort of political patron, sort of supported Napoleon, as we can see, through the 1790s, as Napoleon is a young Corsican man trying to make a name for himself in France. But Napoleon at this point has very much sort of outgrown his patron, outgrown his mentor, and, he is sort of going his own way, and so that relationship has sort of deteriorated, and Barras, like others, is beginning to feel pretty threatened. And we've got Sieyès coming up, who is the other guy you really want to keep an eye on in this video.
Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a former priest who wrote the revolution's most famous political pamphlet.
Yeah, one of the characters who, like I said, this government is really a government of survivors, right? Because, everyone else is dead. They've been guillotined, right? The more moderate members were guillotined during the Reign of Terror under Robespierre. And then following that, the Jacobins were all guillotined. So a lot of people have been executed. There's not many left. Those who remain are the survivors. And it's pretty exceptional that someone like Sieyès has even made it this far. He was one of the more prominent figures of the very early revolution, like 1789. He was probably one of the most prominent figures, but he was just very quickly outmoded. But of course, as you can see, he sort of came back into prominence a little bit later. So this is someone who has been influential for a while, though, at different levels.
Now regarded as the leading political thinker in France. Then, 3 staunch Republicans, appointed to the Directory just 4 months ago, under outside pressure. Louis Goyer, a veteran Jacobin, and former minister in the National Convention. Jean-François Moulin, a Jacobin general who had commanded in the bloody war in the Vendée. And Pierre-Roger Ducos, a more moderate figure and ally of Sieyès. The other major element of government, the legislature, is comprised of the Council of 500, who draft laws.
And you might see the president of that council is goddamn Lucien Bonaparte. So, Napoleon obviously is the biggest name in his family, but he has other family members who are making a name for themselves. In this story, Lucien is particularly relevant. So, Napoleon's out doing military stuff, but, some members of his family are more focused on civilian politics.
And the Council of Elders, who approve them. Members of both councils dress in extravagant costumes, inspired by their great model, to which they refer constantly, the ancient Republic of Rome.
Yeah, well, as we know, this is sort of the tail end of the European Enlightenment. All of these politicians and philosophers and thinkers are absolutely obsessed with the ancients. You can see it in the French revolutionaries. You can see it with the American revolutionaries. You can see it with all of these Enlightenment thinkers. They loved to model themselves after the ancient Romans in particular. And that included some sort of superficial things like architecture and dress and style, right?
This government, the Directory in particular, is now widely regarded as corrupt, ineffective, and unfit to survive.
All true.
And powerful men on the inside will play a leading role in its destruction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course Napoleon is, in retrospect, going to justify his own actions, but the Directory was a bad government, and it's difficult to say how long it could have survived, right? Because it survived a while not doing super well, but it's not like its term was without political chaos. Like I said, there's been constant political chaos, coups, that sort of stuff. So, it's likely that the Directory, at least in that form that we just saw, would not have survived that much longer anyway. I mean, as we'll see, of course, Napoleon, as always, makes himself the main character of this story, but he's not the only one plotting to overthrow this government, and the eventual coup is something that he sort of gets brought into from the outside. So clearly there was already a lot of pressure on the Directory.
On his return to Paris, Napoleon takes up residence in the home of the Beauharnais family on Rue de la Victoire, which has been renamed in his own honor.
Yep.
Given the unsettled political climate, he faces an uncertain and potentially dangerous few months in the capital. One man he can count on as a valuable guide, his younger brother, Lucien. He serves in the Council of 500 as the deputy for Corsica, and has recently been elected its president. As such, he will be a key player in the weeks ahead.
Yes, he will.
But first comes a stormy reunion with his wife, Josephine.
Uh-oh.
Which quickly gives way to a passionate rapprochement.
Yeah, look, I mentioned this in the last video as well, but that recent Napoleon movie, that was all about Napoleon and Josephine, and very little about anything else. So, you're interested in that, go watch that movie. Though, it's filled with inaccuracies anyway, but it has a lot on Napoleon and Josephine, I will say. They definitely did have a rocky relationship, that is well known.
Both have been guilty of infidelities, but Napoleon is clearly still in love, and his earlier talk of divorce is quietly forgotten.
Yeah, while I think not to harp on the movie too much, they absolutely overemphasized their relationship, overemphasized all of it. I will say, their relationship was very important in Napoleon's life, and he was very much still in love. While they both did bad things to each other, a lot of cheating back and forth, Napoleon still loved her, and, he is really hurt by her actions, which, of course, there's a lot of hypocrisy going around, right? Because she would hurt him and he would hurt her. But I think he always felt more wounded because he really, really loved her. And not to say that she didn't love him, it was a complicated relationship, but I do think Napoleon was always more personally wounded by sort of the insults and actions going back and forth.
Henceforth, Josephine will prove a faithful wife, and through her social connections, an important political ally. Paris is awash with talk of plots and conspiracies.
Which is not unusual for Paris, particularly in this era. I mean, we're talking about, the sort of tail end or the aftermath, whatever you want to call it, of the French Revolution. There are constant plots. There's always political scheming going on in the highest halls of government.
Rumours of threats from the left, ex-Jacobins, who oversaw the bloody days of the Terror. And from the right, secret royalists who want to turn back the clock. And there are those who seek a third option. Soon after his arrival in Paris, Napoleon receives a visit from France's ex-foreign minister, Maurice de Talleyrand.
And let me tell you, if there's a plot going on, you can bet your life that Talleyrand is going to be involved. He's the biggest snake of them all. Plotting? Yeah, Talleyrand will be there.
Talleyrand, a keen observer of which way the political wind was blowing, had resigned from the government in July. Having worked with Napoleon in planning the Egyptian expedition, he now proposes they collaborate on another plan.
Honestly, if you kept this timeline going before 1789, and then after this point, you would see Talleyrand has played many different roles throughout his life. I believe he served, 4 or 5 different French governments? This was a man who was willing to cut ties and go with the momentum, right? There's different ways to view that, right? I'm sure Talleyrand would frame it as him trying to do what was best for France, which might mean serving one government and then another. Many have said that he was a very self-serving individual, which I think is probably closer to the truth. But whatever it is, this is absolutely someone who, like they said, recognized the direction the political winds were blowing and was not afraid to jump ship when he felt it was the right time.
To replace the government of France. Napoleon, disgusted by the current regime, immediately welcomes the idea. Talleyrand then reveals that a member of the Directory itself is working to bring down the regime. Sayas.
And by the way, to my understanding, Napoleon's being brought into this coup plot, but there was some debate beforehand as to whether he should be brought in, because those involved, say as Talleyrand and Lucien Bonaparte, were aware, of course, that Napoleon was such a strong character, a strong personality, and a very ambitious one at that, and that he would want to make this coup about himself. And I believe that Lucien, Napoleon's brother, actually warned them that if you bring my brother into this, if you invite Napoleon into this coup, he will take it over. So Lucien will be a firm ally in this story, but even he, at least at the beginning, was like, hey, if you bring Napoleon into this, it's going to be all about him. But they ended up feeling that they needed him, they needed his popularity and military expertise, and so he made it all about him. I mean, of course he did. They knew that.
The country's leading political thinker has decided that the Directory must be cast aside, and that France must have a new constitution, which he intends to write.
Yep.
He plans to sweep away the chaotic, unruly legislature.
Yeah, so the Abbé Sieyès, and he was an abbé, he was a member, a servant of the Catholic Church, who then was a member of the Revolution, a sort of really interesting individual, of course, with some of the anti-Catholic, anti-religious elements of the French Revolution. A lot of Catholic clergymen turned their backs, but there were some that didn't, and Sieyès obviously participated in the revolution. Like I said, he was a big character early on. At this point, It's always kind of hard to quantify someone's political position during the French Revolution because the political scale is constantly shifting depending on who's in power. You could say Abbé Sieyès is sort of maybe more like a moderate liberal type. You know, he's not quite a radical Jacobin, at least not to the extent of Jacobin radicalism, but he's definitely not any sort of conservative. He is, at this time, more of a sort of center or left of center type of figure who is upset with the government due to its corruption and inefficiency and the fact that it's not governing very well.
And its weak, ineffectual executive. To save the Republic, radical reforms are needed, and an entirely new form of government. Sieyès already has the support of another director, Roger Ducos, and the president of the Council of Elders,
There he is.
Louis-Nicolas Lemercier. He
Lemercier.
even has the support of the president of the Council of 500, Lucien Bonaparte.
Some pretty powerful individuals involved in this plot. Lemercier, Lucien, who we talked about earlier, Talleyrand, Sieyès, Ducos, a fellow director. We got a lot of people involved, but that doesn't mean it's going to go smoothly. I mean, France has been submerged in political violence for actually 10 years at this point, you know, starting in 1789. So, you know, it's a shaky situation. It's going to be chaotic, regardless of how many people are involved. Because it's a coup, right? I mean, if every member of the government was involved, it wouldn't really be a coup then, would it? It's just a change of government that the government agrees on. So, you know, there are going to be people who resist this change.
Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché, who has eyes and ears across Paris, is also aware of their conspiracy, but has agreed not to intervene.
Now, Joseph Fouché, he is someone who has been important and will remain to be very important throughout Napoleon's career and Napoleon's government in particular. He is a real nasty, brutal character, someone willing to get their hands dirty, but, you know, someone who was always effective. Well, he was effective. That didn't mean he was always helpful, because Fouché is one of these people who was, first and foremost, looking out for himself. He did have a very effective intel-gathering network. He may or may not share that with you, even if you are his direct superior, but he was an effective and, like I said, very brutal character.
Now, Sieyès seeks a sword, as he puts it, a military figurehead to keep the army on side and be wielded at the decisive moment.
Yep.
And then sheathed afterwards.
So look at the two requirements here. Popular general, politically reliable. Napoleon fulfills one of these two requirements. He is a popular general. Is he politically reliable? Not at all. Napoleon is reliable to Napoleon. He's extremely ambitious. There is absolutely no guarantee that he will be loyal to this coup plot.
But such a man is proving difficult to find.
Yeah, and he's not their first choice either.
Sieyès' first choice had been General Joubert,
Right.
Napoleon's talented subordinate at Rivoli. But he'd been killed earlier that year, shot dead at the Battle of Norvy in northern Italy.
And Joubert probably would have been a good man to fill the role, you know? He likely would have been more politically reliable than Napoleon. He was pretty popular. He was also, like they said, he was a pretty competent individual himself, but he's no longer an option.
General MacDonald is sounded out, but is too much the honest Republican for such skullduggery.
Yeah, he's too outspoken, which I always respected about MacDonald. He always speaks his mind. That doesn't necessarily always help him. In fact, it impedes his career quite a bit. But yeah, he's an outspoken Republican, especially at this point. And honestly, we'll see. I mean, MacDonald will serve under Napoleon. eventually. Not that far in the future, but eventually. And so, a lot of former Republicans become a little more shaky in their political positions. But even then, MacDonald did continue to be outspoken.
Moreau, who has led the Army of the Rhine with great success, declines the role. In a moment he will later regret, he recommends Bonaparte.
Uh-oh.
There's your man. He will make a better job of your coup d'etat than I could.
Well, yeah, I think that's probably true.
Sieyès does not like Napoleon. His ambition is too obvious. It is Talleyrand who persuades Sieyès that they have found their sword.
Once again, Talleyrand sees the momentum. He sees, hey, this Napoleon guy, he is ambitious, He wants to rule, and he probably will rule one day, so let's hitch our wagon to him. And Talleyrand does a good job doing that, right? He does a good job of now staking his career to Napoleon's until it's, no longer a good idea, until it's no longer convenient. Sieyès is, of course, a little more ideological, definitely more principled than Talleyrand, and he has some reservations, but is convinced.
On the 23rd of October, Napoleon and Sieyès meet for the first time. They agree that the Republic is in grave peril, from enemies within and without, and that the Directory cannot meet the challenge. Within a week, they agree to launch a coup to overthrow the government of France.
Treacherous. Huh. Where and when is this quote from? I don't love the no attribution.
Conspirators plan their coup for the 7th of November, 16th Brumaire, according to France's revolutionary calendar. The month of fog.
This is why it's called the Brumaire Coup. And I will say, I've had this on my mind since I saw the title. It's a little unrelated, but I was just going to say that whenever I hear the Brumaire Coup, I always think of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which is this essay written by Karl Marx. It's actually a fairly prominent work of history, and is written decades after this happens. And the point of the work is actually to compare Louis Napoleon, aka Napoleon III, Emperor Napoleon III, his 1851 coup to Napoleon Bonaparte's 1799 coup. This is also where we get the famous quote, I don't have it exactly, but where Marx basically says, history repeats itself first as tragedy and then as farce. This is the tragedy, and Louis Napoleon is the farce, which I think is a fair characterization. Anyway, that's a total tangent, but I've had that on my mind. I just always, when I hear the word Brumaire, that's one of the first things my mind goes to.
It's a risky operation that will take 2 days, during which any number of things could go wrong.
Yeah.
Many of the plotters take precautions. Sieyès carries a briefcase stuffed with cash for a quick getaway. Fouché,
I will say, Sieyès, he was definitely more of a thinker than a doer. He was... It wasn't that he was flaky, but he was just, like I said, more of a thinker than a doer, I think is a good way to put it. I don't think he was ever actually prepared for the actions that needed to be taken. He was always more comfortable just, taking his time to think things out. But this is not the sort of political environment that welcomes that type of attitude.
Minister of Police has drafted orders for Napoleon's arrest in case he needs to switch sides.
Yeah, I'm sure Fouché had a warrant for just about everybody's arrest. That's the kind of guy he was.
Napoleon sleeps with 2 loaded pistols by his bed.
Whoa.
At the last minute, there's a 48-hour postponement. So instead, that night, Bonaparte dines at General Bernadotte's apartment on the Rue de Cisalpine. They are joined by Generals Moreau and Jourdan. He wants the support of these influential generals for his coup. Moreau agrees to help. Jourdan promises not to interfere. But Bernadotte is outraged and warns Napoleon that he'll be guillotined.
Well, and of course Bernadotte, and I know we have one particular Bernadotte fan in the audience. Bernadotte, even though he would serve under Napoleon, him and Napoleon had a lot of issues, right? They were both politically ambitious men, and both would, live up to that ambition throughout their careers. Napoleon maybe more so, but both of them would reach high positions. And, we're already seeing they've got a rocky relationship, politically butting heads. That is something that would continue. Even when they were working together, they would have issues.
We'll see, says Napoleon.
Oh. All right, 18 Brumaire. And that, of course, that is, what the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon is referencing. That his 1851 coup, that is his version of Napoleon's 1799 coup. Wow. Shows you what they thought of the government.
The 9th of November, Paris.
Paris.
In the crisp hours before dawn, Napoleon meets around 60 officers that he's invited to his house. He informs them that he's decided he must act to save the Republic and asks for their support. They affirm their loyalty with oaths of allegiance.
Of course they do. It's Napoleon. He's beloved by the military.
The most important man to convince is General Lefebvre, the no-nonsense military commander of Paris. But Napoleon knows his man. He presents Lefebvre with the sword he wore at the Battle of the Pyramids as a mark of his great esteem, and the general is won over. "Let's go throw those bloody lawyers in the river," he growls.
God damn.
At 7 a.m., the Council of Elders meets in an unscheduled early session at the Tuileries Palace.
It's interesting. When we look, this is looking towards the future, right? But when we look at Napoleon as first consul, then as emperor, it's always interesting trying to characterize his government, because in some ways it's a little bit contradictory. There's a lot of factors at play. One of those things is it a civilian or military government? Now, I would say largely Napoleon... It is largely a civilian government with military characteristics, is maybe how I would phrase it. It could be pretty militaristic at times. And, well, of course it was. But I more mean the character of the government itself. Was it military rule? No, it was at least framed as civilian rule. But we're seeing that, of course, the origins... and, of course, we don't go straight to Emperor Napoleon after this. But... these are very military origins. A lot of this rhetoric are these military men basically saying, these damn lawyers, these damn civilians don't know how to run our country. Let's go and kick them out, right? So it's interesting to see that attitude. And this is something that Napoleon, it benefits him right now, but he will have to sort of navigate throughout his career because, of course, he appeals to the military, right? He's a military guy. But especially when he... is the guy in charge, when he's first consul, when he's emperor, Napoleon has to appeal to the public and to civilian politicians. So at times, he does have to sort of pull back a little bit from this sort of military attitude, which, can be a bit of a difficult thing to do when that is really major career. So anyway, that's a little bit abstract, but it is something you could sort of think about when you see this coup and everything that it leads to.
Only Sieyès' allies have been invited, so without opposition, they quickly passed two measures. First, Napoleon is to be given immediate command of the Paris military district, using the pretext of a non-existent Jacobin plot.
Of course.
Second, tomorrow the legislature will move from its usual meeting place in the center of Paris to the Château de Saint-Cloud, 5 miles west outside the city.
Yeah, so first of all, how do you overthrow the government? You're claiming you're actually protecting the government from a Jacobin plot. Classic. We can see here already that they have sort of a grasp on the upper house, at least at this moment. And, of course, the decision to move the legislature to Saint-Cloud outside the city, essentially, is sort of a smart move as well, because one of the things they're concerned about is mob action, right? I mean, the French Revolution has been characterized by popular action in the streets. People getting together, rioting, fighting. They know that the mob is a powerful force, and so they were sort of trying to sidestep that. You know, I mean, who knows what would have happened, right? Could they have gotten the mob immediately on their side, or would, you know, the people have opposed them? They want to separate themselves from that situation, try to do the political maneuvering among the politicians, well, and the military men.
This, the plotters tell the council, is for their own safety. The Paris mob is famed for its unpredictable and violent political interventions. The move is, of course, to protect the conspirators themselves from such an event.
Of course. Wise.
At 10 a.m., Napoleon arrives at the Tuileries. He speaks to the Council of Elders, reassures them that the trusted generals Lefebvre and Berthier are by his side, and concludes, "We want a republic founded upon true liberty, on civil liberty, on national representation. We will have it. I swear it."
Oh, really? Funny. It's not parts of that, but that's not really how it ends up.
Meanwhile, that morning at the Luxembourg Palace, where the 5 directors reside, Sayas and Roger Ducos announced their resignation and urged Barras, Goyer, and Moulin to follow suit. Barras decides to take a long bath and will not be disturbed. Perhaps he is mulling his options, or waiting for an offer. When it comes, it is from Talleyrand, the man who perhaps understands him best. With the help of an enormous bribe, and the reassurance that he will keep all his estates, Barras agrees to resign.
I mean, that's really what Barras wants, right? He wants to protect himself, keep his wealth, and ideally keep his influence, but that's sort of the lesser of the three. He's essentially losing a lot of his influence here, but he's being promised basically that he can keep his life, he can keep his wealth, and he can keep his sort of social standing. So he's like, meh, alright, this is a man who has survived a lot of revolutionary violence. He's not going to give up the game now.
France's longest-serving director, and once formidable power broker, quietly leaves the stage.
Yeah.
He is driven to his country house that evening, under military escort. Goyer and Moulin are not so easily persuaded, and so they are placed under house arrest.
Yeah, though, really, what Sieyès wanted most was a majority of the Directory. And with Barras conceding, they had a majority. They had 3 of 5. That was the most important thing to get. Now, of course, unanimity is preferable, right? These two. But if they couldn't even get 3, especially already having 2, that would have been disastrous.
By General Moreau. Their objections are futile. With the resignation of 3 directors, the executive is constitutionally defunct.
Exactly.
The conspirators have what they want, a power vacuum, to which they will propose a solution the next day at Château de Saint-Cloud.
I'm sure that'll go super well. I'm sure that'll be extremely smooth.
It will be a day on which the future of France hinges. That evening, as Napoleon rides through the Place de la Concorde, where so many had died under the guillotine, he turns to his secretary. "Tomorrow," he says, "either we will sleep at the Luxembourg, or we'll end up here."
Yeah, I mean, I will say, it is really dangerous to have a coup take place over 2 days, because it's sort of like, ideally, you want to overthrow the government and fill the power vacuum all in the same day. You spread it over 2 days, and that gives your opponents time to, 1, realize what's happening, 2, formulate a response, and 3, perhaps even organize. Now, of course, this is still happening pretty rapidly, but the fact that it is spread out a little bit, I think that makes things a little rocky as well. Adds more risk. Team Brumaire.
Napoleon rises at 4 a.m. and rides to Saint-Cloud. There he meets Murat, newly promoted to General of Division.
And Murat has been by his side. You need a loyal cavalry commander who will take action. You've got him right there.
6,000 troops surround the chateau. Officially, they're there to guard the council members. But as deputies arrive for the day's session, the heavy military presence is impossible to miss.
Yeah.
There are long delays. Benches have to be found for the chambers.
Like I said, the longer this stretches on, the more risk is introduced, the more risk of resistance, essentially.
Council members have time to mingle and discuss the many swirling rumors. This time, the Jacobin deputies are present, and they're not happy.
Well, you know, Sieyès wants this to go as smoothly as possible, and he wants this coup to be primarily civilian-directed, right? But almost any coup is going to need the threat of military force, which is why Napoleon was brought in the first place. Sieyès sort of wants to keep Napoleon, you know, not as the main player, right? He's supposed to be the sword of this coup. He's not supposed to direct it. Now, that is not what is happening. Napoleon is already taking a more central role, and the more important Napoleon is to this, the more of a military coup this becomes, right? We already see it's moving away from a civilian coup and towards a military coup, where that force of violence becomes more and more present.
At being excluded from the previous day's meeting. When the councils finally begin their sessions at 1 p.m., the mood is raucous. The sudden resignation of the directors, the presence of so many troops, the claims of a Jacobin plot. There is much to discuss.
Yeah, and once again, you know, these guys are not idiots, right? These are people who have been through 10 years of revolution. They have seen many coups happen right in front of them, some perhaps involved in those coups, many very close to them. And a lot of them are Jacobins. They're hearing about this Jacobin plot for the first time. You know, 3 of the directors have suddenly resigned. There's a bunch of soldiers guarding them. They've been moved outside of Paris. I mean, it begins to be clear what is happening here. You know, someone is trying to stage a coup of their own, right? And there are multiple different responses you could have to that, but they sort of start understanding what is going on. They're like, yeah, we've seen some of this before.
The plotters had hoped for a quick vote to establish a new provisional government. But the presidents of both councils struggled to take charge. Hours pass. Napoleon loses patience.
Yeah.
At 4 p.m., he bursts into the Council of Elders.
And this is a very famous episode from this coup, and we're going to see more of Napoleon's intervention. But like I said, the more Napoleon is involved, the more it seems like just a naked military coup, which is not the message Sieyès wanted to send, right? He wanted this to be politician to politician, but now you've got the popular generals storming into the legislature. It's not necessarily a super wise move from Napoleon, and we'll see how his interference shapes things, though I will say, things are moving very, very slowly. There's a lot of chaos. Something has to happen.
As he begins to speak, he is heckled and derided. Napoleon is thrown off balance. He rambles, mutters, then hesitates. When a deputy interrupts, "What of the Constitution?" Napoleon flings back, "The Constitution? You yourselves annihilated it."
Yeah, I'm sure they loved to hear that, eh? So Napoleon, he's an interesting figure because, he is this great military leader, and his men truly loved him, right? He had a certain charisma to him, but he was not necessarily the smoothest communicator. He could be a little awkward sometimes, and this is one of those moments where he doesn't sell it very well. Like they said, he's rambling, he's not talking very clearly, he's not really making a good case to the people in the room. He can appeal to his men, and at times Napoleon, he makes a good political appeal to civilians and politicians, but this is not one of those moments. He's really struggling to make his point.
There is uproar. Napoleon continues, demanding action from the council. Anyone who speaks against him, he strongly implies, has been paid by the British. To any such deputy, he warns, "May the lightning of war crush him instantaneously. Remember that I walk accompanied by the god of war and by the god of fortune." These ill-chosen words seem to confirm the Assembly's very worst suspicions.
Yep. Napoleon, if he was going to insert himself into that discussion, really should have tried to keep violence and war out of what he was saying, because like I said, now the deputies are going, "Oh my god, this is a blatant military coup, they're gonna kill us." Maybe not that extreme, but it's starting to look really bad.
By some accounts, Napoleon has to be dragged from the chamber by his staff, shouting, "You are scoundrels! I will have you shot if you don't obey me."
Oh, Napoleon. Not a great moment for him.
Napoleon is shaken, but not defeated.
No, of course not defeated.
Within minutes, he storms down the corridor into the Council of
Let's see if this goes better.
500, where the president, his brother, has lost all semblance of control.
Yep.
The mood here is of even greater defiance.
Yeah, you thought the upper house was bad. Now we're going to the lower house. It's even worse, man.
The deputies have spent the morning swearing oaths of loyalty to the Constitution. And when Napoleon arrives, flanked by grenadiers, he receives a torrent of abuse. "Down with the tyrant," they cry. "Outlaw! Caesar! Cromwell!"
Hey, there you
These
go.
are the names of famous generals turned tyrant.
Yeah, Caesar's always been a controversial character. There have been different opinions on him. But amongst this Republican Jacobin crowd, Caesar and Cromwell, along with Tyrant, these are about the worst things you could be labeled. And like I said, he's being labeled that because it's beginning to really look like that to everybody involved.
As the crowd presses in, he is grabbed, jostled, even punched.
Yeah, he doesn't just receive verbal abuse, he begins to receive physical abuse, which is kind of crazy. I mean, honestly, I think you have to give some credit to these representatives that, like I said, a lot of them are, at this point, fairly self-serving characters. But one, clearly there are some political principles remaining. A lot of them are still intent on defending the government, the Constitution, and not only they're very vocal, but Napoleon walks in there with the grenadiers. They're willing to physically get up in his face. Like, that is bravery, you know what I mean? That they're frankly risking their lives.
Lefebvre and his grenadiers rush in to extricate Napoleon from the scuffle. They haul him clear and drag him into the courtyard outside.
And Napoleon, he gets bailed out. He has to basically get saved by his men.
Napoleon is rattled and bloodied. He seems unsure what to do.
Yeah, this is... We seldom see Napoleon rattled, right? I mean, this is a man who's ready for everything. But I think this is one of the few times when he felt that he was in over his head, right? I mean, Napoleon has been involved in politics, but this is at a whole new level, and things are not going smoothly. And not to say that Napoleon never had any bumps in the road. He has already, and he will continue. Napoleon, could handle resistance in politics and on the battlefield. But this level of resistance, he's actually struggling to make his way through. At this moment, of course we know what's going to happen, but at this very moment, it's beginning to look like this coup might be a flop. It might be a failure. They've taken all this action. They removed the deputies from the city. They told them about a Jacobin coup. They have all these powerful people assembled. The directors have resigned or been put on house arrest. But the deputies are refusing to comply. Napoleon has twice tried to get involved, twice been rebuffed. The second time, especially strongly, the people involved in the coup, even the soldiers, are beginning to get a little worried and demoralized. They're beginning to think, oh, what is going on here? First of all, is this going to work? And second of all, are we doing something wrong? I'm sure some of the guys are at that moment having are we the baddies type thoughts? Like, wait a minute, this seems like this is bad. So the success of the coup is very much in the air in this moment.
His old comrade, General Augereau, now a council member, comes out to see him. "You're in deep water now,"
yeah.
Augereau tells him. Napoleon regains his composure. "It was worse at Arculay." Nevertheless, the coup totters on the brink of disaster.
Yeah, it does.
If the council declares Napoleon an outlaw, it could mean a firing squad or a swift trip to the guillotine. But the riotous disorder has played into his hands. He is the military commander of Paris. When he hears Jacobin deputies are keeping his brother Lucien in the chamber against his will, grenadiers are sent to bring him out.
I mean, in some ways plays into his hands. In some ways, this coup is becoming, like I said, a lot more heavy-handed than at least Sieyès had intended. And even Napoleon had probably wanted. I'm sure he certainly wanted things to go more smoothly as well.
Napoleon attempts
But we're at a turning point.
Rally troops for a decisive intervention. News of his manhandling by the deputies outrages his old comrades.
Yeah.
They are raring to go.
Yes, they are.
But the Legislative Guard, the 400 troops charged with protecting the council, are not convinced.
Uh-oh.
It is Lucien who seizes the moment.
It is. And this coup is saved by a Bonaparte. it's not Napoleon Bonaparte, it's his brother Lucien. He's the one who essentially saves the day here.
He mounts a horse and announces, "Citizens, soldiers, the great majority of the council is at this moment being terrorized by a handful of deputies armed with daggers."
This is not true, by the way. This is the claim they make. There are deputies armed with daggers, and untrue. I mean, I'm not saying nobody in there was armed, but this narrative that's being constructed, it's not true, but it's effective, right? Lucien wins the day here using rhetoric.
"These brigands are doubtless in English pay.
Of course.
I declare to you that these madmen have made themselves outlaws by their assaults upon the liberty of this council."
And also, I think, so, first of all, Lucien's words here are effective. I think also the fact that he is a civilian politician, right? The president of the chamber coming out to say this lends it a little more credence than General Napoleon Bonaparte, who's already appearing heavy-handed and frankly a little unhinged with his interventions.
Then he draws a sword.
I think this, I'm going to go back a couple seconds. What's about to happen? This is the most effective thing Lucien does. Really makes an impression on everybody there, I'm sure, but it made an impression on me when I first, heard this event, heard this speech. Well, read this speech. I wasn't there, was I?
Then he draws a sword and points it at Napoleon's chest.
Yeah.
"I swear that I will stab my own brother to the heart if he ever makes an assault on the liberty of Frenchmen."
That was a lie, but effective, an effective
The
lie.
doubters are won over. A signal is given. With bayonets fixed, troops flood into the Council of 500, with General Murat at their head.
Hey, what did I say? You need a cavalry commander who's reliable, who's going to be there for you. You've got Murat, and he's leading the way.
"Citizens, you are dissolved," he shouts. And then to his men, "Get this damn rabble out of here." The deputies scatter.
Truly a military coup at this point. Just openly.
Some accounts they jump out of windows, leaving their robes and hats strewn across the gardens. Certainly, the conspirators had hoped to avoid the use of troops.
Yeah.
But it had always been a backup plan. One that turned out to be desperately needed.
Yeah, like I said, Napoleon was brought in because coercion would be necessary. The threat of force would be necessary, and potentially the use of force itself. And in the end, they do have to use military force. The conspirators didn't want to, because it sends sort of a bad message, or at least not the message they wanted to send. But in the end, they had to do it, right? Could the coup have been planned better? Yes. How different would it have been? I'm not sure, right? Like I said, the fact that it took so long was absolutely a detriment. The deputies were extremely rowdy. Napoleon's intervention didn't help, at least until his very last moment. So I don't know if it could have gone more smoothly, maybe if the whole thing was redesigned, but given the circumstances, at this point, if they wanted to go forward with the coup, they basically had to get the soldiers in there.
Later that evening, a few deputies are rounded up to form a rump council of 500. Joined by the similarly cowed Council of Elders, they approve the measures that are suggested to them. The dissolution of the Directory, the adjournment of both councils for 4 months, though they will never meet again, and the appointment of 3 provisional consuls, a term borrowed from the Roman Republic.
Of course. I wonder who.
Emmanuel Joseph Sayes, Pierre-Roger Ducos,
Okay, two of the former directors, that makes sense.
and General Napoleon Bonaparte.
There he is. There he is. Now look, Sieyès wanted himself to be the main man of this new government, right? Sieyès was the primary plotter of this coup, and like they said, he was one of the primary sort of political theorists of France at this time, maybe the primary political theorist. He was a very big name in French politics. I'm trying to think who would have had I mean, Napoleon was definitely more popular in the moment, but of course, Sieyès had had a longer, well-known career. He was a big name. This was his coup, essentially, right? There were a lot of people involved, but this was supposed to be his coup. That is not how it works out, right? The second Napoleon is brought in, and I said this very early in the video, he makes it about himself. And Napoleon, as we can see, he gets very involved in the nitty-gritty of this coup, and very much in the governance afterwards. Sieyès wants himself to be the primary politician of this government, but Napoleon ends up as first consul, right? They knew this would happen, or at least they should have known this would happen once they brought Napoleon into the coup. Sieyès was warned, but he felt like he had to do it anyway.
3 years, 8 months since he took command of the army of Italy, Napoleon has risen to the summit of political power in France.
That's a remarkable rise. Bro, even if his career ended here, that would already be a remarkable rise. As we know, he's got a lot further to go.
He will now be one of 3 men in charge of drafting a new constitution for the Republic. But through his brilliance, energy, and immense popularity, he will soon overshadow his 2 colleagues.
Oh yeah, it's already happening.
Only one man will emerge to rule France. The first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. And what better way to cement his hold on power than a new military campaign?
Hey.
And a return to Italy. Do you want to see our newest and most visually spectacular video?
Yes! And you guys should absolutely check out Nebula. I don't know if they're going to give a
link. We hope to see you there soon. Thanks as always to the Patreon supporters.
Alright, well I will leave their video down below, so you should absolutely go and check that out. Give them a like. Give them a subscribe. Check out Nebula. I know there's a lot of great creators on Nebula, so go and check that out. Use their link. Like I said, their video will be linked down below, so please go check that out. Give Epic History some support for making these fantastic videos. So another video in their Napoleon series. You guys know I love the political stuff. I mean, I do enjoy military history, but it's never been my main interest. I do really enjoy me a bit of political history, the machinations of politics and revolutions and coups. I really love this kind of stuff. And this is a very fascinating coup. I think the political career of Napoleon is extremely interesting. Of course, extremely influential for the future of, the entire world. France in particular, but a lot of different places. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I hope you guys did as well. If you did, please leave a like on this video, subscribe, check out my Patreon. It's linked down below. And with all that said, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.